My name is Raeda. I'm a research scientist at Shepherd Center, and I'm an affiliate professor in the Department of Sociology at Georgia State. What I really want to talk with y'all tonight about is COVID and how it has affected people's technology use, as well as looking at how this specifically affects adults with disabilities across the U.S. So I want to give you a lot of background because I was looking at the previous talks, and they're absolutely fascinating, and they are almost exclusively physical scientists. So as a social scientist, I want to give you a lot of context. So the big focus of this presentation is going to be about how do we interact with each other with technology. And so this is going to be something that I think is hyper salient to everyone. The fact that you're here means that it has to be salient because you are literally using technology for a form of communication. And so I want us to walk through 3 different topics. I'm going to cover about 4 different papers that we have either out published or in drafts. And I'm going to introduce you to the research team a bit, but I just want you all to have a context of where we're going. I don't write suspense novels, so I like people to just know where we're going to end up. So the first thing I want to talk about is disability in the US, then technology during COVID, and then lastly, the real hit home point, and that's technology-based communication and loneliness. And so for y'all to really deeply understand this, I think the context matters. All science, the context matters. So let's talk about this a little bit. I have the absolute pleasure of being a scientist at Shepherd Center. We are one of the top rehabilitation hospitals in the United States, and we're down in the deep South in Atlanta, Georgia. We have tons of different areas that we do rehabilitation on, but are the things that we're really known for are spinal cord injuries, brain injuries, and multiple sclerosis. I actually ended up working at Shepherd Center because back in about a decade ago, my mother and I were in a terrible car wreck, and she became a paraplegic, and Shepherd Center in no small feat saved her life. And while I was there, I realized there was all of these social and mental health implications of becoming a paraplegic, and thus I shifted my research to this area, and I've been working in this ever since. And so if this seems very personal, it is, because I have this deep connection to Shepherd, not only as an employee, but also as a family member of somebody who is a patient there. At Shepherd Center, we have this amazing research group, and I have the pleasure of working with a group called the AURC. So this is the Accessibility User Research Collective. It is one of the largest groups of people with disabilities, and it spans the entire US, and it's a self-identifying, and we do amazing work. We get to test all the cool Microsoft products. So I hear consistently, you have the coolest job, because people be like, what'd you do at work today? They'd be like, oh, I filled out paperwork. And they'd be like, what'd you do, Ray? I was like, I tested the new Xbox. And so we get to test smart TVs. We get to test things like just the new versions of PowerPoint. And so we're asking people with disabilities to come in and test these products before they get to market, so that we know that when it hits the market, it's much more accessible. So Microsoft is amazing about this. We do about 30 studies per year. And if you're interested, the only qualifications that you need to join, you need to be an adult in the US with a self-identified disability. And so we pay participants to be in these studies, and 2 of the data collection points I'm going to talk about tonight were collected with this group of adults. So to always give credit, we know that great research doesn't happen alone. This is a group of the researchers on the team. You'll see that there are 2 people in the middle. If you're visually impaired, there's a white female with glasses smiling in front of flowers. That is me. To the right of that, it is a white male smiling in a very professional photo. That's John Morris. He's our research director. In the upper right-hand corner, there's a Black female smiling outside. She is Nicole Thompson. She is she keeps this all going very well. She's our project manager. The bottom right-hand corner, there's a white younger female with blue and brown hair smiling. That is Sarah. She is our newest member. She is a respiratory therapist turned researcher. And then in the upper left-hand corner, there is a male in a wheelchair smiling with red hair. That is Ben Lippincott, and he is been in disability research for a really long time and somehow can always fix whatever I break with technology. I do want to add, these are the different researchers at Shepherd that work on this team, and I do want to add one more. In the bottom left-hand corner, there's a white male smiling in front of a waterfall. That's George Usmanov. He is my former graduate research assistant at Georgia State. And he came in and worked on some of these projects, and he's coming to work with us a bit more starting in 5 days. I'm very excited. The other acknowledgement, we know that research needs two things: great people and funding. All of the studies that I'm going to talk about today are funded by a really nice grant that is from the NIDLR, which is the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, which is in the Department of Health and Human Services. We call it the Live Well, RERC. We have a tremendous amount of research that comes out of this single grant. And as always, the findings here are funded by the Live Well RERC, but they don't necessarily reflect the funders. So there's my disclaimer. We've had it. We can move forward. There's 4 data sources that we're going to heavily pull from tonight. The first 2 are studies that we've done with the AURC. The first one, very appropriate on Twitch, is a survey on video gaming, e-gaming, and esports. And you'll notice that was collected in 2020. We intentionally collected data on video gaming, e-gaming, and esports during COVID. The second study is technology, the pandemic, and social interaction. We didn't think the pandemic would last as long as it did. And when it did last into a new year, we decided to do another series of data collection. So this data collection was done earlier this year. And both of those, the population are older adults, I'm sorry, not older adults, US adults with disabilities. And then the other 2 data sources that we want to pull from for this are the CDC data on disability and the Pew's Research Center for American Trends panel. And what we're going to do with the Pew data is we're going to use it as a comparison point, because the data that we collect are solely on adults with disabilities. And so the Pew Center is going to be representative of all US adults. I want to pause here for a second before we start talking about analysis. I can see the questions. Does anybody have any questions or that they would like to ask about anything that we've talked about thus far? Shepherd, my phenomenal research team I get to work with, our funding, or the data? I see there's discussions about closed captioning, which is funny because Ben and I were trying to do that. That's why we came in a little late. Okay, if you come up with them, I can see the chat, so I can try to answer them. I apologize if there's a lag. So let's start with disability in the US. I am wholly convinced every time I do a presentation to non-disability scholars that people don't realize how many people have disabilities. So in the US, as of 2021, 61 million adults in the US have a disability. That's 1 out of every 4. And so what I'm going to do is, on the left, I'm going to present statistics, and then on the right, I'm going to present a graphic depiction. Somebody asked, is the IRB from Shepherd or Georgia State? Phenomenal question. This data was all collected at Shepherd, and so Shepherd has its own IRB, and we collected the data at Shepherd. I don't get deeply into that because I didn't know that the data nuances as much, because I don't know that people were interested, but I'm more than willing to talk about it. But the IRB is through Shepherd. If you're not a person who uses IRB, IRB stands for Institutional Review Board, and it's an ethics board that reviews all studies to make sure that what you're doing is ethical and doesn't violate human subject protections. So 61 million adults in the US have a disability. That's roughly 1 out of 4. 80% of people in their lifetime will experience a disability that lasts 90 days or longer. And so I always share this statistic because people often think that disabilities have to be static, which means you have a disability and you have it forever. But disability status is actually often very dynamic. People experience a disability for a period of time, and then they either recover, or a condition may get, they might have a degenerative condition that generates them having a disability later, but it is not a static condition. It can be. People can be born with a disability and experience their whole lifetime, but it's much more common for people to become disabled over time. The next one I want to talk about is I'm 35 years old. I just turned 35 a couple of months ago. And this statistic has always really struck me. A 35-year-old in the US has a 50% chance of having a disability for 90 days or longer before they turn 65. And so I share this because I want it to be hyper salient that this is not a chance. This is a significant proportion of our society. People have disabilities. And lastly, if you've ever heard me talk about research before, you know that older adults with disabilities are absolutely my area that I focus on heavily. Interestingly enough, they're not part of this talk. 40% of people who are 65 or older have disabilities that notably affect their mobility. And so this means that people have either a confluence of disabilities that may be seen as more minor, but together they affect mobility, or they may have one or more disabilities that are more severe that affect their mobility. So one of the questions was, what sorts of disabilities are included that people might not think of? People often don't think of learning, this, I always think this is ironic, people don't think of learning disabilities as disabilities. So people who have ADHD, people who have dyslexia, people who have dyscalculia, those sorts of things are really unthought of. Another one is really severe arthritis. So especially given that I study older adults mostly, if people have pretty severe arthritis, that's a disability because it affects their ability to dress, bathe, walk, feed themselves, get in and out of bed. And so just make sure that when you're thinking about disabilities that you can't look at someone and tell. So a lot of the disabilities that people experience, somebody in the chat mentioned invisible disabilities, and these are things that you don't know that someone has. So this could be someone who has diabetes that is managed by diet and exercise. So they're able to keep it under control, but it absolutely is a disability that affects them. Also, on this note, a lot of people who have disabilities who are in older cohorts, they go to great lengths to hide that they have a disability, and they don't talk about having a disability. And so I've interviewed people who have very serious disabilities, and when I ask them, what is it like to have a disability? They're very blunt. They say, I don't have a disability. And so there's I think part of the element that people don't know how many people have disabilities is that there's a self-identification that often doesn't happen as well. So I gave you this so that you can have kind of a visual depiction and think about disability in different contexts in the US. But now I want to get into data, you know, as a scientist, that's always where I want to go. So let's talk technology. We knew that this was a really unique time in history that would allow us to understand more deeply the effect of technology for people who have disabilities in the US. And so I'm going to talk about two series of data collection intermingled here. If anybody's interested, I can tell you which study it's from, but it's from the same pool of those 1,000+ people. This first slide is going to talk about what type of technology devices do people with disabilities have. And I want to share with you specifically and ask you to focus your attention on smartphones. So this is a bar chart that goes from the left to the right. Longer bars mean that more people have them. And so the longest bar is smartphones, and 93.8% of people with disabilities have smartphones. And the people in this stream may be like, well, yeah, of course. Well, here's the thing. In the general US population, it's closer to 70 to 75. So this is a much higher percent of people identify having smartphones. And you'll also notice that tablets, laptops, and personal computers, different ways that people often access the internet, over 50%. So over half of respondents identified having these. Now, you'll notice that these percents don't add up to 100, and that's because people could select as many as they had. And so our things that are 50% or higher are smartphones, tablets, laptops, and personal computers. And if you think about it, all of those are often used to connect with other people, to interact with other people in different contexts, whether it's email, watching videos together, video chatting, whatever it is. The other thing I want to really get you to look at and think about is, and I included this intentionally, is not a single person said, I don't have any of these. So every single person who was surveyed had at least one of these devices. And when we designed the survey, we intentionally said, I have none of these, and we bolded it because we wanted to know how many people have none of these things. And remember, these are people with disabilities, US adults. So this is just what devices do you have? And so the natural next question is, well, what do you use it for? And so I expected, this is another bar chart that goes from left to right with blue bars. The longer the bar, the more people use it, more percent of people who use it. I expected people, it's people with disabilities, right? I thought they would talk about two things, work and healthcare. But work and healthcare are both high, but it's not the highest thing. The highest bar is entertainment and leisure for 86.4%. So people are using their technology devices as their free time. Now, this is not really surprising if you think in the context of COVID. There's only so many times you can clean out your coat closet. You know what I mean? Like after a certain point, you're probably going to turn to online, watching movies, something like that. The second most common thing was community activities indoors. I was very surprised by this finding because remember that this data were collected when people were not supposed to be doing community activities indoors. And so it's a really interesting context to think about how people were thinking of using them. And so if you're unable to see the screen, I want to note everything that's over 50%. Community activities that are indoors, work, healthcare, and entertainment and leisure. Things that are below 50% are school, outdoor community activities, emergency services, and other. So this is just a breakdown of every person that's in the study. And again, this is only of US adults with disabilities. Somebody asked, did we look at the geographic distribution of the participants, urban versus rural? I just want to let you know that I will send you your gift basket after this. That's actually our next project that we're starting in July. Because I'm really interested in how far away people live from resources. And so we actually have several studies at Shepherd looking at this right now, but we collected their zip code in the study so that we could map what are trends, not only how metropolitan or non-metropolitan, but also how far from a metropolitan area are you? Phenomenal question. Thank you for that. So given that so many of these things are entertainment and leisure and activities, I wanted to also think about how important is the internet to you. So this is the first time that I'm going to be presenting data for people with disabilities and the general population. And this was really stark to me. The data on the right is from Pew in 2020. The data on the left is from the AURC in 2020. 85.2% of people with disabilities said that the internet was essential for them during COVID. Only 53% of the general population said the same thing. And so we see that people with disabilities at a notably higher amount are saying that the internet was really essential for them. And as a researcher, I'm always interested in what's the biggest group. I'm also always interested in what's the smallest. And so the smallest group is not at all important. So for people with disabilities, only 0.4% said the internet has not at all been important for me during COVID. And the general population, not at all important, was 3%. That's over a 6-time difference. And so people with disabilities are using technology more. They're using it for a lot of things. And the internet is really pivotal for them during COVID. And so the question after this is, well, what are they doing? And so we asked people, and we took the Pew questions and we asked them of our population. So we would be asking the exact same question about what have you done online during COVID? And so this is a bar chart that represents two populations. There's a bar that is a deep red that is for the general population, and then there's a bar that is blue for adults with disabilities. The deep red data is from Pew, and the blue data is from the AURC. And so there's 4 different areas: food access, health, social, work, and school. You'll notice that some of these only have a blue bar, and that's because it was only asked in our study. We wanted to make sure that we asked about things that we knew would be relevant. So some of the blue bars are, did you have a telehealth appointment? Did you attend a virtual religious event? And did you attend a virtual meeting for work? And on this, every single topic was more people with disabilities reported doing them at a higher amount, often triple. And so some of them that are the most stark is ordered groceries online. 22% of the general population stated that they ordered groceries online, while 62% of adults with disabilities identified that they ordered groceries online. Now, I want to make sure that we're very clear that this data was collected near the same time, but not at the exact same time. So there may be a latency effect. People may have not ordered groceries until, I think our study was about 3 months later. I'm just being kind of devil's advocate. It's very unlikely that there was that big of a shift in 3 months, but it's worth noting that the time points were a little different here. And so we see the most stark differences with food access and, well, it's really food access is the biggest one. Social is the second biggest one. And so we, in other studies, we also interviewed people and they talked about how much of a learning curve it was to be able to have social events online. So like streaming parties or video chat. But once they figured it out, it became part of their daily life. It became a very routine thing for them. And it largely replaced their social interaction that they were missing out on from before the pandemic started. These next two slides, I kind of went back and forth on if I wanted to share them or not. But given that this is Twitch, it only feels appropriate to talk about video games. And so we also asked people about, based on their disability type, well, we asked them, what's your disability type? And we asked, do you play video games? To see, do certain types of disabilities, people who have certain types of disabilities, do they play video games more or less? The journal, this is actually a screenshot from our publication. The journal that we publish in has a very weird notation for statistics. So if you're a statistician and you're looking at this, ignore the stars. Stars mean it's not significant, and usually the reverse is true in analysis. And so what we found was there are differences in some types of disabilities for if they play video games or not. We see that people with anxiety play video games less. People who have fatigue and limited stamina play video games less, and people who are blind play video games more. And so, wait, I think I mixed that up. I was reading the wrong thing. So people who have anxiety play video games more. I apologize. People who have anxiety play video games more. People with fatigue and limited stamina play video games more, and people who are blind play video games less. As soon as I got to the blind, I was like, I know that's not right. So we actually tested almost 40 different types of disabilities, but these are the staples that we see in the disability scholarship, and thus our first pass, we use these 7 categories. You'll notice that these 7 categories cover different types of disabilities. There's physical disabilities, there's mental health limitations, there's things that are kind of more. You have issues with your hands or you have issues with your arms, versus blind is you cannot see. So there's different ones that are in here. And we did this intentionally because we didn't want to lump everybody with a disability together, because that's what most research does. Most research is like people with disabilities, people without disabilities. And so we really wanted to look at some breadth in there. So this is just about, do you play video games? And then this next table is a lot. I warn you before I pull it up. This is based on the type of disability you said that you have. What's your favorite kind of game? And so this, I think, really speaks to it, Shepherd. We really care about quality of life, not just like condition. And so the disability type that is here is based on how they self-identified. So we asked, do you experience any of these disabilities? And whatever they self-selected is the disability that they were qualified under. Now, people can be in multiple, and people often do have multiple disabilities. We see this is especially true with things like anxiety and a learning disability. We also see that people who may have a spinal cord injury will have a walking limitation, but also an upper extremity limitation. And so these are how they self-identified, and they can be in multiple groups. We were a little bit surprised that how popular word games are. And so we gave them examples of each of these. but word games are consistently a top contender in games. And we expected it to be more action adventure, something along those lines, but word games really consistently took it home as people's favorites. I don't know if it's chance, but it seems like nobody likes VR, which is interesting because Georgia State has a huge virtual reality lab and it's always full of people, but maybe it's the same like 10 people and I didn't know. But VR and exercise games are consistently ranked very, very low as a favorite type of video game or game for people with disabilities. So this next section is going to be talking about, we're going to take a shift away from a descriptive of what do people like, what do people use, and we're going to move it into what is a predictive model. And so if this type of research is not in your traditional wheelhouse, or even if it is, I'd like to take just a minute and explain the difference. Descriptive analysis just says, this is the people in this group, and maybe are they different from other groups? A predictive model says, given these specific sets of variables, can I predict a different variable? And so it sounds very complicated, and honestly it is, but really the take-home message is you're trying to say, if I know this one thing about you, can I predict this other thing about you? And so that's what we're going to do here. We're going to look at different facets of technology-based communication and loneliness. So before we go down this too far, I want to make sure we operationalize technology-based communication, which is a fancy research word for define. Technology-based communication, we're going to measure in 4 different ways, but the way we defined it before we started the study was any communication that is commonly used by the general population to communicate. Now, you may think that that's kind of weird that I'm giving this caveat, but there's a lot of technology that people with disabilities use to communicate that we didn't include in this, because we didn't want to talk about what kind of technology do you use for your specific disability in a specific context. We wanted to know of the commonly occurring general population technology-based communication, what are you using and does that relate to your loneliness? So this is going to be represented here. We ask about interaction through gaming. We talk about calling people, texting people, FaceTiming or video calling with people. And so I just wanted to kind of give you a context of what does technology-based communication mean. So I, like most scholars, firmly believe in we don't reinvent the wheel. So I want to talk a little bit about what other scholars have found and then talk about what we have found. You'll notice that there's some citations, and those citations are just denoted by a number that is grayed out. And so anytime you see a number, there's a study that's associated with that that's supporting what's being said here. And I'll share those at the very end if you're interested in any of them specifically. Okay, so thinking about disability and loneliness, we know that having a disability is something called a chronic stressor. A chronic stressor is something that you deal with on a regular basis. It can be more stressful at times and less stressful at times, but it's something that's consistently there. And chronic stressors and disabilities are associated with poor mental health. And so there's studies that measure this in different ways: depression, anxiety, which are more classic conditions, as well as experiencing high levels of stress and loneliness. And so we know that disability is associated with poor mental health in all of these areas. We also know that loneliness is associated with a lot of poor health factors and negative health behaviors. So this is for the general population. We know that people who identify as being lonely have higher blood pressure. They're more likely to engage in coping mechanisms like smoking cigarettes and drinking alcohol. They're more likely to have eating disorders. They're more likely to struggle with other mental health things like depression and anxiety. They have much higher rates of deliberate self-harm, and they generally have a higher rate of mortality. So loneliness has, I realize the mood just got kind of like dark, but like loneliness really matters. And this is something we need to think about very deeply, as it affects not only mental health, but it manifests in other parts of people's health and well-being over time. We also know that social interaction is a buffer for the effect of disability on mental health. So we know that, like I mentioned before, that disability is a chronic stressor that affects people's mental health, We also know that social interaction is a buffer. And so when I say buffer, that means that it not removes the effect, but it lessens the effect. And so if you have really quality social interaction, we see that disability when predicting mental health is not as strong of a predictor. The problem is most studies focus on quality of social interaction and how do other people help you for people with disabilities. So they ask about things like, do you enjoy the time you have with your friends? Does it bring you fulfillment? How do they help you maybe with your medical needs? They don't focus as much on the frequency and how you communicate. And so looking at, so do you enjoy spending time with your friends is a typical question, but not how often do you spend time with your friends? And so we're going to dive more into the how often and how do you communicate with them. COVID has strongly suggested that we physically distance. And so this is a kind of a perfect time for us to really think about this in context of how does disability and technology and mental health and loneliness kind of come together. Which brings us to technology-based communication. COVID has made us physically distance, and thus, if we want to social interact, we've largely had to do it through technology. Technology-based communication and loneliness has been tested with the general population a ton. It's been tested with phone calls, texting, online chat, and video calls. The research very, very rarely, if ever, includes people with disabilities. The only research that has looked at technology-based communication that's heavily notable in terms of COVID-19 for people with disabilities is older adults who are in nursing homes. And so I don't know if y'all remember May of 2020 feels like 15 years ago to me almost. But when nursing homes locked down, they really leaned into technology to do a lot of FaceTiming and group calls to really try to connect older adults with their families, because research consistently shows older adults without connections, their mental health is just not as strong. And so there was a big push for this, and there was research that came out about it, but that's really all of the technology-based communication in relation to people with disabilities that has come out. So the goals of the study that we're going to dive deep on is to look at differences in levels of loneliness by types of disability. So we know that disability and loneliness are related, but is it all disability types or is it only specific disability types? And then the second thing we're going to do is that predictive model to look at disability type, social interaction, and technology dependent communication. Does that predict someone's level of loneliness? And so how we're going to do this, other than the data I talked about earlier, is we're going to use a thing called the stress process model. And so I want to explain the stress process model, not with disabilities, and then talk about it in context of disabilities and loneliness. This is Perlin's model. It's from the 1980s. It's a very well-known, very well-respected model. And what it says is we have stressors in life, and those stressors cause outcomes. The outcomes are usually measured in poor mental health. And so the stressor affects your outcome. So if you have a large stressor, but the effect of the stressor to the outcome can be limited by the buffer. And so this is a visual depiction of that. There are gray circles with all of these topics in it. Stressor is in a gray circle pointing to outcome that's in a gray circle. And then there's a mediator of that's called buffer. And there's two buffers that are present, one above the other. So here's a classic example of this. You go and you check your mail tomorrow morning and you open it and you have an unexpected $500 bill, and it's a legitimate bill and you need to pay it. Most people in that moment kind of freak out, right? They're like, oh my gosh, how am I going to pay this? This is so much money. I didn't expect it. Now, I want you to imagine in a serendipitous act, you also, on your way back from your mailbox to wherever you live, you pick up a lottery ticket that someone dropped and it's worth $500. That could be your buffer. So I have this stressor and it gives me stress, this bill, and then I find $500 that covers that bill. Well, then you don't actually, most people don't care about the outcome at that point. They might still be like, oh, I can't believe I have to pay this, or oh, what a pain, or I didn't expect it. But the stress immediately relieves for most people to a very manageable level. And so we're going to test the same model, and instead of it being an unexpected bill and a stress, which is not the same as having a disability, I just want to make sure that I make that adamantly clear. They're two very different, but I think hyper-salient examples. This is testing, does the type of disability you have predict your loneliness? Because we know disability to loneliness is a relationship. Does social interaction mediate that? And does technology-dependent communication mediate that separately? And so if you're not a statistician, or if you're not a person who models a lot, you might be wondering to yourself, Raeda, you're talking about technology-dependent communication. Why do you have social interaction in here? And I say, brilliant question. That is because if we include social interaction and we separately include technology-dependent communication, we're measuring them as two separate entities, and thus we can see if the relationship is different for each of them. If you are a statistician, I want to be your friend. We did test it for multicollinearity when we ran the model, and there's no multicollinearity. If you don't know what that means, that's really cool. Just act like you do. It's a good thing in statistics. So let's start walking through the measures. So we have disability, loneliness, social interaction, technology-dependent communication. Loneliness is measured with the UCLA short loneliness scale. It's a 3-question, really easy. How often do you feel lonely? How often do you feel isolated? How often do you feel left out? Ranges from 0 to 6. Higher values mean you have higher amounts of loneliness. We measured disability with this series of measures. We used 8 dichotomous variables for learning disability, anxiety, difficulty speaking, upper extremity limitations. Upper extremity limitations is a combination of having problems with your hands or your arms, or hands and arms. Those 2 variables were combined. Walking or climbing stairs, fatigue and limited stamina if you are blind, not if you have a vision problem, but blind or you're deaf, not if you have a hearing problem, you are specifically deaf. We had tons of other disability measures that we will also test. That's a future project that will start probably in July, maybe August. Then we measured social interaction in 4 different ways. We didn't want to just ask how often do you interact with your friends. We wanted to measure this in a myriad of contexts because we know that social interaction looks different for different people. So the first thing that we asked was, the first interaction variable that we used was, how often do you initiate conversations outside of work? How often do you have friend interaction? Do you live with a spouse or partner? And do you do gaming as a social activity? And so we wanted to measure different ways that we could measure social interaction. We did assume that if you live with your spouse or partner, you interact with them, but that was an assumption that we didn't explicitly ask in the data. Then we measured technology-dependent communication in 4 ways: video calls, calling on the phone, texting on the phone, and interacting through a video game system. These questions were made very, very intentionally. You'll notice, if you ignore for now interacting through a video game system, as we go down, it becomes less like in-person communication. So when we were designing this study, I specifically wanted to talk about as close to in-person as interaction as we could do, which is a video call or a webcam, then stepping it back from that a bit, which is calling on the phone so you can, if you are hearing, you can hear voice, you can hear inflection, and then texting on the phone to me is basically an email, but it's one of the most common forms of interaction. And so I wanted to have a kind of breadth and type of interaction that people would have. And then lastly, we only used 2 control variables. Control variables are used in a model when they are not the focus of the analysis, but we know they're related to the outcome. And so we used age and we used sex. The reason we used age is former research, including my own, shows that older adults are more likely to have disabilities and they have distinctly different social interaction patterns. So people who are baby boomers have different interaction patterns than people who are millennials and people who are Gen Zs and people who are of the greatest generation. We also know that men and women have different social patterns, and social patterns deeply come up both in our model and in our outcome. And so we wanted to make sure that we controlled for both of these. So let's fly through the descriptives and get to the models. So the average loneliness score was 2.56. So 0 to 6, it's about halfway. So we didn't see a high amount of loneliness. We didn't see a low amount of loneliness. It was about in the middle. For disability, the most common disability that was reported is having a limitation with walking or climbing stairs. This should not be really surprising. We do not specifically recruit from Shepherd Center, but Shepherd Center is a spinal cord injury rehabilitation center. It's one of our 3 main areas. We also have a large amount of people who are blind and a large amount of people who are deaf, and that's because of deep personal and professional connections we have with the blind and deaf community, both in Atlanta and across the US. Other more common disabilities that were reported was an upper extremity limitation, anxiety, and fatigue or limited stamina. For social interaction, we measured it in 3 ways. Most people are initiating communication. So it ranges from 1 to 4. 4 is you initiate communication daily. And so most people are initiating quite a bit of communication. They're at a 3. Amount of friend interaction, it ranges from 1 to 6. 6 is the highest amount of friend interaction. So that would be interacting with about 25 or more friends in a month. People are about at 2.85, which is about halfway. 47% live with a spouse or partner, which aligns with most national data. And about a quarter, 23%, play video games with other people. Because remember, it needs to be social. It's not by yourself. You play with other people. The communication mode, most people text. 86% of people say they text. 63% of people call. 48% of people video called or webcammed. And 17% interacted through a video game system specifically. We did ask I think I would have to double check, but I know it was in the context of COVID. So this wasn't of all time. This was like in the last 30 days or in the last 2 weeks. So it was very COVID specific. And for our control variables, our average age is 46. Our youngest participant was 21. Our oldest participant was 86, and 51% are female. So 49% identify as male or non-binary or another sexual identity. So let's start talking differences and stop talking descriptives. People who have these 4 disabilities, learning disability, anxiety, difficulty speaking, or fatigue and limited stamina, report higher levels of loneliness than other types of disabilities. And so this is a independent sample t-test just comparing the average of the loneliness for people who have a learning disability versus everybody else. And that's repeated for each of these. So we do see that there's differences for these 4 types of disabilities, but interestingly, I think more interestingly, these other 4 disabilities, upper extremity limitations with walking, being blind, or being deaf, they're not significantly different. And so the averages are very close, and statistically, they're not different from each other. And so the first thing we wanted to establish are, do different types of disabilities have different types of loneliness? Because the literature has basically just said over and over, people with disabilities are more lonely. And we found, okay, yes, but certain types of disabilities are more lonely than other types of disabilities. You'll notice that there's no group that was significantly lower. And so what we tested. So basically what we're seeing here is people with disabilities have a standard level of loneliness, if you will, but there's some exceptions that have slightly higher levels of loneliness. This into a predictive model, we're going to talk about figuring out what predicts loneliness. And so I want to very quickly, very briefly explain the statistical model. If math is not your jam, just think about something else for a second. This is a multiple regression model. So what we do is we take the beta of the intercept. You may call this the constant based on your home field. We take the beta of disability, the beta of the control variables, and then an error term, and that's our predictive model. And so what I'm going to report on each of these models is only what came back significant. So all of those different types of disability we talked about, only people with anxiety, their disability predicts their loneliness. And so that's really powerful that we only see with that one group, people with anxiety do report higher levels of loneliness. We also find, contrary to most research, that younger adults are more lonely. And I want to postulate, sorry, my dog just pushed something over. I want to postulate that this is because older adults often report that they're more lonely in general, but younger adults are the ones who lost their more traditional constant social connections. Did older adults lose connections? Absolutely. But if you think about the average amount of social interaction in person that different age groups have, younger adults were the ones that went from kind of full throttle to nothing, and older adults went from an average or below average amount to a lower amount. And so we see that younger adults are reporting that they are notably more lonely than older adults. The next model talks about social interaction. So just looking at social interaction. And so people who have more friend time are less lonely. People who live with a spouse are less lonely. But people who interact via video games are more lonely. And this is a big discussion point that we don't have an answer for. So if you have any theories or ideas or want to discuss this, I would really love to hear people's perspectives on specifically why people who interact via video games are more lonely than people who don't interact via video games. My theory is it's a selection effect, but that there may be something else here. And again, younger adults are more lonely. Model 3 looks at just the technology-dependent communication. And so people who use forms of communication that are closer to in-person interaction are less lonely. So video calls, people report being less lonely. People who call others are less lonely. People who text are more lonely. And so earlier, I really harped on, we wanted to measure technology-dependent communication in different forms, the ones that mirror in-person interaction to the ones that don't mirror in-person interaction. And this is because prior to being at Shepherd, I was a professor at Georgia State, and I've had the distinct pleasure of being a faculty member for over a decade. And I've just noticed that people who are on their phone, and because I see hundreds, if not thousands of students, people who are on their phone all the time texting, they just seem really lonely. And I was like, it's an empirical question, let's ask it. So this was a question that was put in more of a hunch, if that makes sense. And then younger adults also have a higher level of loneliness. Somebody asked, what's the Chromebox value in your regression model? By which Chromebox specifically? Are you talking about an R-squared, or are you talking about the alpha level that was used? I'll answer it when you answer that. I'm assuming you mean the p-value or the alpha. And so the last model is the model that really matters. This is a model that puts everybody in together. This looks at disabilities, social interaction, technology-dependent communication, and control variables. And what you'll see here is anxiety comes back. So anxiety consistently is here. Every time disability is included in the model, anxiety comes back as more lonely. And you'll notice that all of those social interactions, they fell away when we included technology-dependent communication. And so this is probably a product of when you don't have a high statistical power because you have a smaller sample size, relationships, only the most salient relationships come through, only the most significant ones. But we do see that age is not significant, sex is not significant, 7 different types of disabilities aren't significant, none of the social interactions are significant, but 3 of the 4 technology-dependent communications are. And so that tells us that there's something deeply connected with how people are communicating, not are they communicating, or do they live with other people or anything like that. We see there's a deep connection with how are you communicating with each other. If you are anything like me, when I go to research talks outside of my field, you probably feel like a Krispy Kreme donut right now. You're kind of glazed over, maybe your mouth is open and you're like, I think I got it. But I always like to end with I love when people end with what should I know from this? What's my takeaway? So here are the conclusions. People with disabilities use technology more for day-to-day activities and interactions. So reaching way back to almost an hour ago when I was talking about all the different types of technology people use and how do they use it. We also see that the internet was more instrumental for people with disabilities during COVID. Then we found that there is a relationship between types of disabilities, social interaction, technology-dependent communication, and loneliness. And the strongest one of those is technology-dependent communication. And anxiety, but it's related to technology-dependent communication is the strongest predictor. And people who have learning disabilities, anxiety, difficulty speaking, as well as fatigue and limited stamina report higher levels of loneliness than other types of disabilities. All the other types of disabilities we tested did not have significantly different levels of loneliness than the overall average of all other disabilities. And lastly, what we really were trying to hit home with all of these, with most of these studies, is that when technology dependent communication mirrors in-person interaction, people are less lonely. And so we do plan on doing a follow-up study that examines how often do you interact in person versus how much do you interact via technology to see if your loneliness levels are different there. But currently what we are consistently finding over and over in our repeated cross-sectional data is the closer to in-person the technology-dependent communication is, the less lonely people are. And so interacting in a very technology kind of cold way, which I would consider texting to be the strongest measure of that, people are more lonely when they're doing that. That's not a causation, that's a correlation. So they're related. We're not necessarily saying that one is causing the other. Earlier I mentioned that there's works cited, so here's all of those. I think this will be posted somewhere if you have a yearning, burning desire to look these up. I flew. I'm sorry. I got excited and I started flying. So here's my contact information. Email is probably the best if you want to ask questions about data, but I'm pretty active on Twitter. It's definitely more of a research platform than a social platform for me. So thank you. Does anybody have any questions they would like to ask?
Yeah, so I think what we'll do, I think there were a couple of questions that weren't answered during the talk. So uh, if it's all right with you, we'll go through. Actually, yeah. So there's a few more questions coming in now. So I tell you what we can do is we'll run through them and kind of go from there. So we've got this one was from a little bit earlier in the talk where you had the columns and one of them had disability in it and it said no or yes. We had somebody asking, did that disability column mean that the participant considers it a disability?
So, if you could do me a huge favor, I'm going to flip back to that. But if you have epilepsy, could you close your eyes? Because I don't want to cause any issues. But I'm going to flip back. Okay.
Here, yeah, there we go. I'll block the screen real quick.
Okay. I just don't. It's so bad. I don't want to do that to people. Okay. It's ready for when you want to share.
Okay. 1 second. All right. There we go.
So I'm going to move the mouse a little bit. So this disability type, we never identify people. People self-identify.
Mm-hmm.
And so we give a long list of about 40 different things. Sometimes they're called conditions. Sometimes they're called experiences. Sometimes they're explicitly called disabilities.
Okay.
But these are all self-identified. So people had to actually go in and check. So we don't say, okay, so Raeda Anderson, we can look at her private health information and we can see that she has a walking limitation, so we're going to check that. Gotcha. So this is a self-identification. I do want to mention that the people who participated in the study very regularly participate in our studies. And so if they don't have a certain type of disability, they don't qualify for the study, and we validate that. So we have very little concern about people giving incorrect data to Gotcha. Kind of be like, oh, I want to be able to participate, so I'm going to say something. I've actually never, this is the first group I've ever worked with where we don't have to question, because there's always kind of that element in the back when people are getting paid of like, I don't know, like, are they saying this? But so these are self-identified. Everything in here is self-identified.
Okay.
That's from the URC data. But that's a really phenomenal question. That's a good one. Thank you for asking that.
Let's see. Okay, so in this part where you were talking about the different measures, it was a little bit later on from this.
Okay.
The question is basically were the measures only survey based, or did you also do interviews?
Oh, okay. So these are all. I'm gonna flip again. I'll let you know when I'm here. Okay, I'm here.
Yep.
So
Okay.
for measures, all of this data are collected via surveys. So while we do a tremendous amount of interviews, because we do a lot of user testing where we like record them testing technology, these are surveys, and part of the reason we do surveys is we want to make sure that they have no more of a time commitment than 20 minutes.
Oh, okay.
We really try to be like, we want to get you in and out because we don't want to eat up a bunch of their time with data collection. So we do absolutely do interviews for other studies, but the data that we're talking about here is all survey data.
Okay. Good deal. Let's see. Oh, so Rama, I don't know if you heard or not. You asked about the Cronbox value. Could you specify which one of those you were referring to? And we'll follow up with the question that you had asked about that.
Yeah, the reason I asked about which Cronbox alpha is because different disciplines define what Cronbox alpha means differently, which was something I didn't know until 2 years ago. And so I don't want to be like, oh, it's 0.05. And they'd be like, then it's not. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
which one are you talking about?
Okay. Okay, so our next question here, so this is a good one. Basically, in you had the different types of interaction, so the video calls, phone call, texting, and then video games. And so this question here is basically, so the video games aren't really considered to mirror human interaction. Is that a fair statement?
I don't. So I'm gonna go to it really quick. There's actually two measures of gaming. So there's a measure of gaming of social interaction. So do you game as a social activity? And then there's also a measure of do you interact through a video game system? And so when I was talking about this, I may have spoken too quickly, or maybe I just said it in my head. But the interacting through video game system, I meant to say ignore that. And then if you look at the rest of them, they kind of go from most like in-person interaction to least like in-person interaction. The interacting through video game system, I am not a gamer. I got introduced to Twitch through you. And so like I've spent a lot of time thinking about this because you can interact so many different ways. So I've like been watching Twitch and there's videos of people playing and they have these deep personal relationships, it seems like, through some of their viewers. And so I think that that's an empirical question that would be really good for us to think about is not just do you interact through a video game system, is it just voice? Is it voice and video?
Yeah.
Is it only text-based? And that's a question, and it's a limitation of this because we didn't really dive into that very much.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so for the Cronbox values, Rama was asking, she was looking at the measures where you were determining your beta 1, 2, and 3 values for the linear regression model.
Oh, okay. So we use a really standard cutoff of 0.05, so a 5% amount of error. And to kind of just talk through the models, since you're clearly an analyst, we use a standard p-value or alpha type 1 error, whatever your discipline may call that, of 0.05. So we allowed 5% error. Most of the variables, though, were significant in an alpha 0.001, which means they had a 0.01% error in them, and the R-squared values were relatively high for a social science study. They were around 0.5, 0.6, which means 50 to 60% of the variation in loneliness was accounted for in the model.
Nice. That is high.
Yeah, no, it was awesome.
that's nice. Let's see here. Okay, so the next question is, does the type of disability affect the ability to video or phone call versus texting?
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. The amount of ability that people have to use technology and communicate for people who have disabilities is absolutely amazing. We did a study a couple of months ago of people, I don't know if y'all know this, but if you screen share, people who use a screen reader, they can't tell what you're sharing. It's like pointless. That's why, I don't know if you noticed, but when I was talking about people's pictures, I made a point to describe them, because if anybody here uses a screen reader, this is pointless. They don't know what's here.
Right.
But what's amazing to me is I was able to hear people's screen readers talking in one ear of my stereo, and in the other ear, I was listening to the conversations, and less than 5 minutes in, I couldn't keep up. And so it's an absolute learned skill that people have deeply developed. And so the types of games people play, the type of technology they use, and the different ways that they use that technology is absolutely affected by their disability. But most people with disabilities that we talk with, and it may be a selection effect, they have found these amazing workarounds that they share in their community that are sometimes from kind of healthcare researchers, but a lot of times it's just ways that people have figured out how to make their machines more accessible.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. Huh. Yeah, I always learn more than I feel like I always learn so much more from the study than Microsoft, which we find all this cool stuff from Microsoft, but all the time I'm like, oh, that's really smart. I hadn't thought about that. Like, oh, yeah. What about, oh, great. I should try that. Right. Blue light glasses, like blue light filter glasses. I didn't really use them before working with this population. And I mean, my sleep is better. Like, I feel like I'm not tired as much. They're great. If you don't have blue light glasses, please get them. Yeah, even if you don't have a prescription.
Yeah, that's good to know. So one of the things, a question I had was, I noticed that that people who had anxiety tended to, in general, tended to be more lonely. I know you can't necessarily draw a direct causation there, but do you have some suspicions about what that correlation might be due to? Is it like people with anxiety have more trouble reaching out to other people, or is there some kind of hypothesis that you have for why that correlation may exist?
So I wouldn't say it's my hypothesis. I would say based on speaking with therapists and people who have anxiety. And I say that very intentionally. I try to never have a theory, because I do not have a disability. Okay. And thus I do not speak about, I'm not like, well, this is why. But right. There's been a lot of discussion around a thing called a selection effect. And so a selection effect is sometimes we see that things people experience are not because of their situation, but because their personality selects into both of those things. So let me explain this in a different context and come back to anxiety. There's this idea that people who have PhDs are smarter than the general population. Well, maybe. There's some data to argue the opposite, but maybe it's because smart people are more likely to get a PhD, and thus PhDs on average are smart. So it's a bit of a chicken and an egg, and that a chicken and an egg is the selection effect. And so there might be a chicken and an egg anxiety thing happening. I have anxiety, and therefore I don't reach out for social interaction, or I'm lonely, and it's a thing that bothers me so much that I have developed anxiety around it because it's something I want so badly. So we don't know if loneliness is feeding into anxiety, or if anxiety is feeding into loneliness, or if it's both. Because we know that reciprocal relationships, very complicated things like this, very internal dialogue of people's mental experiences, there's a lot of reciprocal things. It's kind of like some of my research, I talk about like people get in an emotional tornado. They just get caught in this cycle and they're not able to break out of it. And so we both affect each. And so I am not a mental health expert, but I do think that's a good question. And it wasn't really, it was, but it wasn't surprising to see loneliness and anxiety to be deeply connected with each other in that manner.
Yeah, it's a really interesting correlation there. But I mean, I guess it's also interesting that the type of communication also had, there was at least some correlation with that as well, which is a little surprising to me. But again, I mean, especially the video game system interaction and even the gaming with friends. I personally, I would have expected a more positive effect. So it's really interesting that especially the video gaming with friends didn't help the loneliness. But I wonder if that's
When I presented this research to some more formal groups, we're all dressed up and we're as dressed up as you can be in a Zoom conference, and one person goes, "Dr. Anderson, what's the takeaway?" I was like, the takeaway is pick up your phone and FaceTime your mama. That's the takeaway. Like, don't send a text. Like, and it makes sense. What often means more to us? People video calling us and wishing us a happy birthday, or a text message that says happy birthday.
Right.
I mean, different people have different preferences, but like, there's a sense of there's a difference there. We need to not act like it's the same, because it's not the same.
That makes a lot of sense.
That makes sense, I think.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Was there any other? These are so good. These are such good questions.
Yeah, we usually get a lot of really good questions. That's one of my favorite parts. People come in from different backgrounds, and so they all have different thought processes.
For sure.
Yeah, I guess so. If there are any further questions, definitely get them in. You, like I said, you're welcome to ask as many as you would like. Let's see. Rama says that the interagency committee on disability research had apparently has some work from prior to the pandemic that might be relevant, so you might be able to compare.
I'm going to check them out. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, this is really fascinating. Like I said, I figured it'd be really cool, but this is really neat.
I want to scan and see if there's other questions that I did see.
I think that was all of them.
Okay.
But yeah, so if I'll go ahead, I'll start wrapping up a little bit. But
yeah, for sure.
If anybody, this isn't a cutoff, so if you have questions, definitely get them in. I'll be happy to stop myself and ask them. But I will say thank you to everybody for coming out. Thank you, Dr. Anderson, for a fantastic presentation. It's really cool to see how these things sort of correlate with each other. Like I said, so some of it is as expected. Some of it definitely is not, and so it's really fascinating to see how these different types of technology and communication sort of interplay. It's really fascinating. It's both an informative and informative talk. So you really can't ask for a whole lot more than that. And definitely appreciate you coming on and giving the talk.
Yeah, for sure. If I can,
yes, please.
Can I give a takeaway message?
Absolutely.
So I recognize kind of from the questions that there are people who are disability scholars and things like that that are in this very clearly based on the questions, and thank you for being comrades. So kind of my takeaways are, if you didn't realize how many people have disabilities, you know people with disabilities. You actually know a lot of people with disabilities. You just don't necessarily know that about them. The other thing that I want to mention is, and I hope this became very clear kind of at the beginning, mental health manifests in other parts of your life. And so be very cognizant of your mental health and mental health of other people around you, because mental health is one of the strongest predictors of morbidity, mortality, quality of life, all of these sorts of things. And so I don't say that to say if you struggle with mental health, or if you're researching people who have struggles with mental health, their life is not good. I'm not saying that at all. But I am saying that there are resources and there are studies, a lot of studies, including studies like this out there, that show there are things that we can do outside of very valuable therapy is so valuable, medication is so valuable. There's additional things we can do. Call people, spend time with them, find ways to like interact deeply and meaningfully. And so I just want to mention those things as like, those are two things that I think that a lot of people don't really think about. There's a lot of people with disabilities, and mental health affects you more than you know. And so really taking the time and intentionality with that is going to be super important.
It's very true.
And again, like a lot of people put their email up and like they put it up, they don't actually want you to reach out. If you have a 3 a.m. moment of brilliance and you want to email me, please do.
Yeah.
I got a cold message on Twitter about this, and I was totally open to it. So please feel free to reach out.
That's awesome. And we did get one quick question in here from Rama asking if you've gotten in touch with any schools about your research to try and assist in student therapy sessions.
Great question. About 3 months ago, we reached out to every single university and college, university, and technical school in the state of Georgia. And we reached out to their disability access office, and we heard back from 2. And
Nice.
so, I say that to say, like, we reach out quite a bit. We put out a lot of like white papers. We only publish, I shouldn't say only, almost every single thing we ever publish is open access, because we want to make sure that people can have access to this. But it isn't often, unless people seek it out, we don't get a lot of feedback that people are, and that it maybe we just don't know, but we haven't been very successful in that. And so if you have any ideas of how to do that effectively, or even if you don't know specifically, but you have hunches, I would love to hear them, because we're applied scholars. Like, we do this work to help facilitate people improving their lives. Do we care about impact factor scores? Honestly, no. But
Yeah.
we publish because we want to make sure that people have the data, because we have a unique opportunity. But so if you have any ideas, I would love to hear them. I know somebody actually on here right now is a therapist, and I regularly ask them questions about the scholarship to think in context of how this affects people. But I would love to hear more perspectives and suggestions.
Fantastic. That's a wonderful thing. Yeah, so I guess we'll give a little bit more time in case there's any final questions for anybody. But again, Raeda, thank you very much for a great talk. Like I said, informative and entertaining, and that's what we're going for. You can tell from all the questions you got that it was a really interesting thing, and several people in chat are talking agreeing and saying basically it was a fantastic presentation and really well done.
Yeah, for sure. Thank y'all for listening to 4 shoving together studies into one presentation.
Absolutely.
It was cool. Awesome. Thank you for reaching out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, my tea glass is empty and it's almost midnight, so I think I'm gonna call it.
Okay. Can I get you to hang on for just 1 second? We'll talk very briefly. All right.
Yeah, but y'all feel free to reach out and let me know if you have any questions, ideas. I love when people reach out and be like, hey, could you think about studying X? I can't tell you how many studies have come out of a random conversation. And so please don't be intimidated. Just reach out. I love to talk with people. I love to hear people's perspectives. And so feel free to.
All right. Well, that sounds good. So thank you again, Dr. Anderson. Thank you to everybody for coming out. We will be back next week. Next week is actually a special one. We have that's like our what I'm calling Science Palooza. We're aiming for 24 hours. It looks like it's going to be more like maybe 7-ish. But we have several talks lined up that day. I'll be posting about it on Twitter and putting the schedule up. The talks are from all over the place. We have STEM education, chemistry, engineering, polymers, all kinds of good stuff. So definitely, check that out. I'm on Twitter at Meekins Lab. And so certainly feel free to follow on there. I'll drop the Discord link one more time for anybody that might want it. And this talk will be put up on YouTube. It'll probably go up later tonight. It usually takes a couple hours to process. So certainly by tomorrow morning, it will be available there. It'll be the talk and all the question and answer stuff here at the end. Excuse me. Thank you everybody for coming out. Have a great weekend. If you haven't gotten vaccinated yet, please do that. And hopefully we will see you next Friday. Election started at 8:50 in the morning, and we'll go through most of the day. So hopefully see you all then. Thanks everybody for coming out.